What the heck is going on with Lincoln? In spite of some well-reviewed cars, their sales in 2022 actually fell to a level that nearly matched the sales they had during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. I like a lot of what they're doing, but I think that decades of mismanagement has finally caught up to them, and I've identified 3.5 things that have been impacting them and held them back from being revitalized. Mismanagement and the fact that management just doesn't seem willing to invest in them, number one. Number two, I think they're hearkening back to a heritage that doesn't really resonate with any consumers that they're trying to reach. And number three, no sense of momentum. That ties in with their product line right now. Well, welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John, and I'm a big fan of Lincoln. I like what they've been doing now for about 5 years. And you know what? Maybe the fact of the matter is, the fact that this guy likes Lincoln might define why they're not doing very well. I don't know how big the market is for a 50-something-year-old guy who wants a nice, sedate driving experience to stretch into in a near-luxury car. But Lincoln has been hamstrung for decades by Ford, and their sales have always been pretty good, but they've always played almost always second fiddle to Cadillac. There was a few years that they actually sold more than Cadillac, but for the most part they are still just using Ford platforms, nicer interiors, different styling, and generally you could describe them as nice Fords. And I think if we go back to the 80s, we're not going to do a whole history of Lincoln here, but if you go back to the 80s, you can see this, that Lincoln really had trouble figuring out what to do to straddle a changing world. While their traditional buyers wanted Lincoln Town Cars and Continentals, big body on frame, big engine, smooth cruisers, those young, upwardly mobile professionals of the time, they wanted BMWs and Mercedes and then later Acuras. And Lincoln tried their best to try to straddle that, catering to their first clientele while downsizing dramatically as well and coming up with things like the Mark series that were more focused on what the younger people might like. But I don't think anybody really looked at a Mark and went to an Acura dealership and thought, I want the big heavy V8 one. So they struggled with their product mix for a long time, and this bled into the 90s and beyond of them using older platforms from Ford, doing a lot with them, but using older platforms like the Fox and the Panther platform and creating new Lincolns with them. Now, part of that is, of course, that they were starved for cash on the interior, just like Cadillac did. Ford never really invested on matching the Europeans or, in the 90s, the Japanese in terms of the quality of the materials throughout, or an investment in that durability of the entire car as a whole. They came out with some really good stuff, and it sold relatively well. While they lost sales through the 80s, it largely tracked with Cadillac. So they lost, but they weren't really losing relative to Cadillac. And then in 1993, I think it was, they came up with the Lincoln Mark 8, which was absolutely a gorgeous car, still built on the Thunderbird platform, but it had new V8 from Ford in it. It was an excellent performer. However, it was overly large. It was not really something that I think they would be cross-shopped with, say, a Lexus, an Infiniti, or an Acura, for example. But it was a really beautiful car and should have heralded a new styling direction for Lincoln, and to a lesser extent it did, but it didn't really carry on. They went back to being rather generic and boring after that. By the late 90s, they had started to be wrapped up into the Premier Auto Group. Now, this was a collection of luxury brands that was being assembled. Volvo, Land Rover, Aston Martin, and Lincoln, for example, were all wrapped up into one division meant to dominate the luxury world. And the idea was that these different brands, these different makes, would be able to share technologies and achieve some synergy between them, and it never really worked out. What it ended up doing, within a few years, it was being torn apart, it was being sold off. It sucked an estimated $17 billion out of Ford. Money that could have been invested in Lincoln. I want you to think about that. $17 billion. Ford could have invested in 2 completely new platforms, new engines, new transmissions, and world-class manufacturing facilities to truly take on the best of the best. And they wasted it assembling a collection of other manufacturers that didn't really work together. Now, Lincoln did get something out of this. That was the LS. And this was actually a platform shared with Jaguar, and it is one of my favorite cars from that era. A little boring in terms of styling, but an excellent, excellent car. And contemporary reviews at the time actually described it as the size of a BMW 5 Series with the power of a 3 Series, and excellent, competent handling. It was a great car. So, of course, Lincoln abandoned it. They replaced it eventually with the Zephyr. Now here we see a Ford Fusion, a Mondeo if you're from the European market, and it is a pretty good looking car, but it still falls into that nice Ford category. It's smaller than the LS, but I like the name Zephyr. Zephyr, that's a very strong name. But 2 things happened here. The first is that harkens back to a heritage from the 1930s. So if you're leaning towards trying to attract those young professionals with disposable income and you're trying to go up against the BMWs, the Mercedes, the Acuras, and the Lexuses, why are you referencing something from 70 years beforehand? And of course, because I do think it was a strong name, Lincoln immediately abandoned it. And they finally and belatedly got onto the alphanumeric train, just like Acura did when they abandoned the Integra and the Vigor names because the names were becoming more popular than the brand Acura. Lincoln decided to abandon names as well, and they went with MKZ and then the MKS as the larger car, which has always been confusing. Now that MK still represents them with marketing on a heritage that I don't think their actual target clientele cared about. The MK was supposed to reference the Mark series, which they were selling, but the Z is smaller than the S, even though they come this way in the alphabet. Even I, as someone who is pretty interested in cars and follows them, I always have to stop and think which one's the bigger one, and then the S was based essentially on the Taurus. So they immediately started screwing up their names. Now there was life at Lincoln. Certainly we referenced that Mark 8 before. It was beautiful. And Lincoln saw that there was going to be a market for luxury trucks, and they came out with the Blackwood, which was a horrific failure, sold for 1 year, but at least it had a real name, and Lincoln was thinking right. They came out later with a replacement, a new one, the LT. It sold for a few years, and it sold modestly well. So what did they do? They abandoned it. And of course, they put the LT nomenclature on it, just because why let it have a name that actually made some sense? Lincoln continued to struggle along on this way, and in 2011, they actually canceled the Town Car. Now, that's the cancellation of an entire platform, but I think it was, at its end, still one of their best sellers, and really alienated a lot of their buyers who wanted that big, large body-on-frame car. And now that the Crown Victoria and the Impala were going away, there was nothing out there for them. Now, during all of this, they came out with some really good cars, and in fact, showing more life at Lincoln, they came out with the Navigator a year before the Escalade came out. But it was the Escalade that went on to define the entire market. Let's face it, rappers went off and sang about their Escalade, not their Navigator. But Lincoln still has a proud history. You know, books, TV shows, and movies are written about the Lincoln lawyer, not the smart car lawyer. And Lincoln tried to tap into it, but they ended up with a series of products that were just okay. And consider that MKZ, as it got older, it actually was a really good car. It had a strong engine, it was comfortable, and the dash was not as nice as some other things out there, but it always fell into that, if you're a young, upwardly mobile professional with disposable income and they're trying to capture you for future years of products, why would you buy this over something else if you could afford it? Lincoln never really seemed to put their heart into it, or more specifically, their management never really seemed to put their heart into it. They never seemed to be willing to truly invest to make world-class products. Now, Cadillac did. They started, for better or worse, started investing heavily in outside styling, engines, transmission, handling prowess, and eventually into their interiors. And I think there's a really strong argument that Cadillac is more BMW than BMW is right now. And here we have Lincoln with sinking sales. Now, in the late 2010s and in 2020, they came out with several really good products, and they kind of retrenched themselves, and I was really excited about what they're doing. One thing is they have actual names now. The Navigator, the Nautilus, the Aviator, and the Corsair, a personal favorite of mine. They've invested in actually hiding the Ford roots of their platforms. That Corsair, for example, it's based on the Escape, but you wouldn't know it. And they've invested in their interiors. I really, really dig this kind of mid-century modern interior they've got going on. They've invested in ride quality, in sound quality, and they've come out with some exceptional products that stack up extremely well against their competitors. But they're also pretty proud of them, and the prices have climbed as well. Take that Corsair, for example. It's a nice car, but at its top level, you're talking about a $60,000 compact Lincoln. There's several other cars you can get into that are arguably more desirable. And Lincoln, they're not there. Their prestige and their history is not going to carry them at the prices they're actually trying to charge right now. And I'm afraid that management's going to look at that and see it as a reason to start cheapening everything up again. The other thing you'll notice is missing is cars. Now, Ford made the decision to move heavily into sport utility, so they don't have a lot of car platforms out there. And it could be argued that cars don't sell right now. But look at their competitors. Cadillac sells cars, Audi, BMW, Mercedes, Genesis. They all sell cars, whereas Lincoln is hamstrung with a lineup of 4 vehicles, and they're all SUVs. And here's what's really challenging is that in spite of Ford's management finally investing in the platform, in the interiors, in building a product that stands up pretty well, sales have begun falling. I think part of that is the mix. Part of it is they're hearkening back to a heritage. I don't think there's a market for it. Well, I really dig them. Quiet, sedate, American luxury. That's what they're aiming for. I don't know how many people are out there looking for that. They need a different twist on it, because I do think that luxury, quiet luxury, with engines that provide oomph, but you're not chasing somebody around the Nürburgring, I think there's a place for it, but Lincoln's missing the mark on it somehow. They're missing cars. They're not bringing people in. And it's sad because they have actual cars in other markets. Lincoln over in China has a gorgeous Z, Lincoln Z. It's glorious. Of course, they don't bring it here. And finally, that leaves me with momentum. And there's a sense that something is happening at a manufacturer, and it does kind of feed in more, in my opinion, than advertisements. See, Mercedes, they're moving heavily into EVs, so at least they have something to talk about. They're getting press about it, and there's a sense that there's a future there and that they're investing in it. Same thing with BMW, although they get criticized for their horrific grills. And Genesis, let's talk about them. This is a relatively new brand. They don't have many dealers out there, but it does feel like every 2 weeks they're coming out with a new product that somebody can write an article about. When's the last time Lincoln did anything that anybody could write about? Well, they've had a couple of concept cars, and what Lincoln kind of needs is a halo. But while Lincoln is putting out halo concepts that may or may not happen in the future, Cadillac's over there building them. Lincoln feels like a brand that has been starved, ignored, and left to die. While they're investing in products, and those products are pretty good, it doesn't feel like there's any interest that management is paying any attention to them. And part of this was the deal with Rivian, as a matter of fact. Ford had a much heralded partnership with Rivian, and part of that was an electric vehicle, electric truck of some sort that was going to come to Lincoln. But when that deal fell apart for whatever reason, Lincoln was left high and dry. But why? Because I don't know if you know this or not, you can go to the Ford dealer and there's an electric truck right there. Why isn't something based on that coming to Lincoln? They've got the products. They just need the management to say, this is what we need to do, and we need to boost up this portfolio of products and really start to compete. And that kind of begins the question, does Ford have the resources, not just the willpower, but do they have the resources to invest in the products for Lincoln and make them special? Right now, I don't think the answer is yes. They still use Ford platforms, but are they ready to invest in Lincoln and say, you know what, it's been 40 years, it's been 50 years, it's been 70 years. Let's look at what BMW and Mercedes are doing and go after them. There was a brief period, 2018 to 2020, that I thought that's where Lincoln was. But sales have proven it's not. And when was the last time you heard something interesting about Lincoln? Let me know your thoughts below, guys. Appreciate you being here.